Well, good morning. Welcome to LifeSpring. If you are new here, my name is Dylan. I'm one of the pastors on staff. Super excited to see you this morning. I especially want to say welcome if it's your first time ever in church or your first time maybe back in church in a long time. We are absolutely thrilled that you've joined with us today. If you have a Bible and you want to follow along, we're going to be in 2 Corinthians 4 for like 2 seconds, then 2 Corinthians 3. If you don't have a Bible, no worries. You can follow along on the screen. And if you don't own a Bible, you can drop by our information desk out front, and they will have a Bible for you completely for free. We tend to, as people, place way too much value on looks. And when I say looks, I mean the way we look, our physical appearance, that sort of thing. For instance, how many of y'all have ever taken a picture or a selfie or whatever, and you've taken at least 5 of them before posting it on social media? Anybody like 7 honest people? Okay, that's great. When it happens for me, it's my wife taking the picture. I would rather people not take pictures of me, but my wife insists on it sometimes. So, and then why do we do that? Because we're like, oh, my lips will look weird in that one, my eyes are closed in that one, I look too big in that one. I mean, we think we need to get the perfect thing on social media so we can get like 2 likes and have our self-esteem boosted. But we place a really high value on the way we look. We think the way we look impresses people. This is why when guys are dating, that's why, ladies, if you're single, you need to know this. That's why they try to wear nice clothes, because as guys, we think, you know what, if I'm trying to win the affections of this girl, then I need to present the best version of myself. So if you're dating this morning, then let me just warn you, ladies. The shirts that are holy, and by holy, I don't mean sacred, I mean they have holes in them. And the shirts that are see-through because they've been washed so much that most of the fabric is gone from them, they own them. And if you get married, they're coming out about 6 months after you get married. I'm just warning you. So if you're like here, you're in love, and you're like, everything's going to be great, I'm telling you, he's got those clothes around. And you'll wonder, why does he wear that? But right now, he's trying to impress you. But after he's already got you, then it might be a little different. So, but when you have that sort of thing happen, this is why we wear like ties to work interviews, because we think, well, I need to dress to impress. I need to look the part. I need to look good. And so I try to wear a tie or whatever, because if I look good, it'll impress people. People think more highly of me. We have to guard against even that thinking with this building, because the tendency can be to think, well, if we have a nice building and it looks good, then that will make things work. And it's an attractive line of thinking, because I had the term applied to us when we were over at JCC. Man, it's a pop-up church, and it's like, it's not a pop-up church. It's a real church, kind of like Pinocchio and Shrek. I'm a real boy, except we're a real church, that sort of thing. But even there, the idea can be, man, we've got to look good to impress people. If I look good, it impresses people, and they like me, and so on and so forth. So we've applied that thinking that we tend to carry around in our lives to how we tend to think about Jesus. For instance, when you think about Jesus, do you not think about someone who's probably about 6'3", cut, long, lush locks, like might have come out of a Head and Shoulders commercial, and somebody who looks fairly attractive, right? Don't we tend to think that? I mean, yes. I mean, case in point, there was a BuzzFeed article that I found last night in preparation for this that said, and I quote, I'm not going to say the whole thing, but it said, 15 fine blank men who have played Jesus. And the idea being, well, if somebody's going to play Jesus, they need to be attractive, they need to be good looking, they need to embody like this feeling of divinity coming from them. So we can tend to think Jesus is attractive because in order for us to be impressed with him, he would obviously have to be good looking, because we have to be good looking to impress people, so that's the way that Jesus would have to do it. Here's the thing about that. If Jesus walked in the room this morning, none of us would be impressed with him. You might say, what? Doesn't sound right. The Bible says this, Isaiah 53 verse 2, it says this: he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of the dry ground. This is the major part. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. This guy Isaiah writes over 700 years before Jesus walks on earth, and he writes this prophesying about Jesus, and he writes that, man, the Messiah, when he comes to earth, there's not going to be anything in him that is impressive. Well, like to look at him, he's going to look to be just an average, ordinary guy. You might say, how average? Well, let's consider the way he was born. He wasn't born, like if you were expecting God to be born, like Jesus, from eternity past, he existed, but he came as Man, if you were expecting God to be born, you would expect like a bigger deal than the recent royal wedding or whatever. Like God's going to show up. They probably wouldn't live stream it because that would be really, really weird. But you would expect a lot of flash, a lot of bang, a lot of publicity and that sort of thing. And yet when God in flesh shows up, he's born in a stable with the smell of animal dung and animal urine and put in a trough where animals have eaten out of. That doesn't seem very impressive. You say, how unimpressive would Jesus be? I didn't tell you I was going to do this. Can you come here real quick? This is my lovely wife. Her name is Grace. Come here. You have heels on, so it doesn't really work. Okay, but that'll be okay. Come on. No. Come on. So my wife without heels is about 5'2". With heels on, I don't know, maybe 5'3", 4", something like that. So Jesus, according to studies, the average Jewish male about the time Jesus was living on earth was 5'1". So that would put Jesus about here. You can sit down now. Thank you. See, we tend to think Jesus tall, impressive. No, Jesus is probably about 5'1". That means most of you in the room probably taller than Jesus. That doesn't feel very impressive. And then you look at the way Jesus died. He dies the worst possible death imaginable. He dies the death of someone who committed treason. He dies hanging on a cross, bleeding and naked, and losing control of his bodily functions in a gruesome, grotesque manner. This isn't what we tend to think of as God. This isn't what we tend to think of as, oh my gosh, I'm amazed at Jesus. He's awesome. We tend to look at that and think, well, that's not very impressive. And yet Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. He says, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory. Watch this. Displayed in the face of Christ. The idea being this. God fully displays his glory. God fully displays his worth, his majesty, his beauty in the person of Jesus. And from the outside looking in, he doesn't look super impressive. Now, he will when he comes back. Read Revelation. But when he showed up, it didn't look impressive, didn't look awesome, didn't look like anything that would take your breath away. And yet Paul says the fullness of God's glory is displayed in the person of Jesus. So where we're going in this series, where we're talking about this idea of, man, how do we develop this view of God as God being awesome? Because most of the time we don't think of God as awesome. We think of God as someone I can get stuff from, someone who's convenient. But if we're going to actually live for God, like our sign says out there in the lobby, if we're going to actually live for God, it starts with developing a view of God that really does see God as awesome, as majestic, as beautiful. And last week we talked about if we're going to do that, we have to start looking at what God has done. And God has revealed his glory in all that he's done in creation. But God also reveals his glory in Christ. But in order for us to properly develop a right view of God and his awesomeness, we need to develop a right view of Jesus. And that right view is not one with lots of flash and lots of bang. It's something that's a lot deeper. Because, and this is so important, please understand this, God is not interested in flashbang. He's interested in something much deeper, much more profound, and much lasting. So we're going to do kind of a case study here from 2 Corinthians 3 and kind of compare two different things that kind of show the glory of God and how great he is versus something that we would maybe tend to be impressed with, but maybe couldn't quite be or shouldn't quite be so much. So if you're from a church background, then you know who Moses is. Moses, guy that God used to deliver the people of Israel from slavery, all that sort of stuff. If you're not from church, then that's just good information to know. They've made a couple movies about him. The Charlton Heston version is way better than the Christian Bale version. It just is. That makes me a little old school. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. And way better than Prince of Egypt, the cartoon. That was just kind of not really that impressive. So think about Moses here. Paul's going to write something about Moses in 2 Corinthians 3. He says this, now if the ministry that brought death, which by the way, that's a term to refer to the Ten Commandments, the ministry of Moses, how God used Moses to deliver the people of Israel from Egypt. It's called the ministry of death. You might be like, well, why is that? We'll explain it in a little bit. Which was engraved in letters of stone, came with glory so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory or temporary though it was. Here's some things to draw out of that. When God did what he did with Moses, It was obviously supernatural. Well, like when you think about God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians to get them to let the people of Israel go, obviously supernatural stuff. When you consider that he parted the Red Sea, and the miracle is not just that he parted the Red Sea, it's that the people of Israel went across on dry ground. That's obviously supernatural. When you consider that the people of Israel were given water to drink from a rock, and that God fed them with the Krispy Kremes of heaven. That's not in the Bible, but it says, man, it was like wafers made with honey. That sounds like fresh, original, hot glazed Krispy Kreme to me. And they wake up to this every morning. God then leads the people of Israel through the desert with a pillar of fire by night. That's impressive. And a pillar of cloud by the day. He does all this supernatural stuff, and that's what Paul means when he says the 10 Commandments, all this stuff that happened with Moses, it came with glory. It was impressive. It was obviously supernatural. And yet, watch what he says here in verse 10. For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. The idea here being this. Paul takes all this stuff that God did with Moses, including this thing that I didn't mention a second ago, that every time Moses would meet with God, his face would be shiny, kind of like Timothy in Moana, Shiny, that song. Maybe that song gets stuck in your head now. You'll be happy. You're welcome. But his face would be so shiny that he had to wear a veil to cover his face for two reasons. One, so that the people of Israel could actually look at him. But two, so that they wouldn't see his face growing dimmer as the glory kind of faded. So what Paul says, all this awesome stuff that happened with Moses, obviously supernatural, obviously miraculous, obviously God. He's like, you know what? Compared to the person of Jesus, that's like old black and white TV compared to ultra color high definition TV. It's just not that impressive anymore. That's confusing. Because the one, lots of flash, lots of bang, lots of shock, lots of all, obviously supernatural. And then Jesus, who from the outside looking in just looks like a regular old carpenter who died a gruesome death, who grew up in this backwoods Jewish town called Nazareth, Paul's like, he's way more impressive. In fact, all this stuff God did with Moses, even though it was incredibly supernatural, it doesn't even begin to compare to the person of Jesus. So it begs the question, man, why is that? Verse 11, we get a hint. And if what was transitory or temporary came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? So here's where we begin to see exactly why Jesus is impressive. Jesus isn't impressive because he looked the part of divinity when he was here on earth. He wasn't impressive because everybody liked him. In fact, a lot of people and most people didn't like him. The reason he's impressive is because he did something that lasts. He did something that is permanent. See, we mentioned this ministry of death idea for the 10 Commandments a little while ago. The reason it's called the ministry of death is because, yes, they came and it was awesome. It was incredible. It was miraculous. But you know what the 10 Commandments could not do? They could not destroy this barrier that separates people and God. And that's our fundamental problem. We all have a barrier between us and God. It's called sin. And sin is not just something that we do. Sin is something that we are. It's hardwired into the very core of our DNA. And it simply means that we have a nature that is prone to do things that God hates. And we can't help it. We just do it. And so God gives the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel. And we can tend to think, if we look at that through the wrong lens, that, oh, God's saying if you do all these things, you'll be right with him. No, what God was saying is, here's all these rules, and guess what? You can't keep them. It's impossible for you to keep them. In other words, you can't possibly fix the barrier between you and God. God didn't give the 10 Commandments to show the people of Israel a way to God. He gave them the 10 Commandments to show them just how separated they were from God. And then Jesus shows up. And Jesus lives the life that we couldn't live. He lives a life that is free of sin, free of regret, free of shame, free of imperfection. And then he goes to die on a cross in our place. And the reason it had to be Jesus and the reason he had to die is because every single small sin we do is infinitely evil when you compare it to an infinitely good God. And if it's infinitely evil, then therefore, if God is perfectly just, and He is, then it deserves infinite punishment. And therefore, the only way for that infinity of evil and that infinity of punishment to be taken care of is if someone infinite in nature and infinite in goodness stepped in to pay the penalty. That's what Jesus did. And because of His life, because of His death in our place, and because He came back to life, He permanently destroyed the barrier between us and God. The Ten Commandments could not do that. But this seemingly, from the outside looking in, average Jewish carpenter who died this gruesome death, that gruesome death is exactly what did for us what we could not do for ourselves. It destroyed the barrier between us and God, far more glorious than all this obviously supernatural stuff that happened with Moses. And makes a way for us to come back to God. Moses is like, hey, the person of Jesus, way more glorious, way more impressive than all this stuff that happened with Moses. Now you might be wondering, man, why are we talking about this? Why are we drawing this comparison between supernatural stuff with Moses and Jesus who, yes, he did miracles, but if you're just an average observer who didn't know much about Jesus, then you're thinking, kind of an average looking guy, not super impressive. Well, why are we making this comparison? Here's why. Because whether you're from a church background or not, we all have this tendency, and it's this. Well, I would be more devoted to God, or I would believe in God to start with, if He would prove Himself to me. If He would do something obviously supernatural, if He would do something obviously miraculous, if He would prove Himself, then I would believe, I would bite. And that's not an illogical line of thinking, because we all apply that thinking to different areas of our life. For example, how many of y'all like hummus? Show of hands. My hand's kind of halfway up, and I'll explain in a second. When my wife and I were first dating, I learned that she liked hummus. And I know what hummus is. It's crushed up chickpeas. There's nothing about that sounds good to me. Like you're going to take this funky little bean, you're going to mash it, you're going to put some olive oil in it, and you're going to eat it. Like it just kind of sounds gross and disgusting. And she liked to get everything hummus. And I was like, what's everything? And I still don't know what everything is. I don't know. But she's like, do you like it? I'm like, no, it looks disgusting. And she's like, well, have you ever tried it? I'm like, no, I don't need to try it. I can look at it, and I can observe that it is disgusting. It just does not look appealing to me. And so we go back and forth on this for years. And finally, she's like, just try it. I'm like, okay, fine. So I got a chip. I dipped it in the hummus, and I had a big old glass of water because I was like, I know I'm going to taste this, and it's going to be repulsive. I'm going to have to wash the nasty taste out of my mouth. And so I tried everything hummus, and lo and behold, I liked it. Now, I don't eat it that often, and there's only 3 types of hummus I like. Everything hummus, black bean hummus, and chocolate hummus, interestingly enough. Whoever invented that, like, you made beans good. That's genius. But what happened? There was something that kind of got proven to me, and I was like, okay, well fine. This is good. I can buy into this. And we tend to apply that same thinking to God. If God will prove Himself, if God will show Himself to be awesome, then I'll actually think He's awesome. If He does something that takes my breath away, then I'll buy. I'll believe. But watch what Paul writes about the people of Israel in verse 14. He says, but their minds were made dull. For to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. The veil being, they don't see God for who He is. They don't see God in His glory. They don't see God in His awesomeness. There's this distance between them and God. There's this separation between them and God. And he says, for only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their heart. Here's the idea there. Two specific kind of time periods to talk about. First off, you would think, at least this would be my thinking, that if God miraculously supplied me Krispy Kreme donuts every morning for breakfast, I'd be like, you got my worship. The Israelites had that. They had water from a rock. They saw God lead them with a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. They saw God bring them out of Egypt. They saw God part the Red Sea. You know what happened within days of Moses going up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments? They're like, I don't know where Moses is, and I don't know where God is. Let's get all of our gold and jewelry and make a cow, and let's worship it and say that's our God. Let's worship steak. After they've seen God do all this stuff, again, this is why this is so important. After they see God do all this obviously supernatural, obviously miraculous stuff, you would think they would be convinced, and yet they see it all and they're like, cow, let's worship it. And then you get to the Jewish religious leaders in Moses' day. Y'all, they saw Jesus raise a guy from the dead. You know what their reaction was? It wasn't, we need to worship this guy. It was, we need to kill him. We need to get rid of him. They saw him heal people. And they're like, he's a threat. He's got to go. So here's why we're drawing this distinction, because we tend to think if God would just prove himself, if God would just show himself to me, do some sort of sign, do some sort of miracle, I would buy into him. I would believe. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. Because we've seen throughout the pages of Scripture over and over and over, God shows himself in miraculous ways, and people are like, eh. God's not interested in showing you a lot of flash and a lot of bang, because that's not going to change your heart. Hey, listen, even Jesus did miracles. That didn't change people's hearts. The only thing that changes a person's heart is coming to know Christ. That's why Paul writes this in verse 16. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. The idea being this: to see God's glory requires surrender to Jesus. If you want to develop a view of God as awesome, if you want to see God for who he is, you know the way, you know how you do that? You dive into the pool with no life preserver when it comes to following Jesus. See, here's the problem for so many of us in this room. The reason we don't have a high view of God, the reason we don't live lives completely devoted to God, is because, say this is the edge of a pool, we're kind of dipping our toe in. And we're like, well, maybe I'll try Jesus. I don't think it's that impressive. I'm just kind of dipping my toe in the water. You will never, ever, ever live a life fully devoted to God as long as you are holding something back. You want to know how to get there? You want to know how you get to the place where God is truly impressive to you and God really puts you in a place of awe and wonder? It's when you say, okay, nothing held back, no plan B, I'm completely diving in, being completely surrendered to Jesus, and I'm fully devoting my life to him, whatever happens. That's how we get to this view of God as God being awesome. And see, that's the problem for some of us in this room. The reason we're not there is because we ain't fully surrendered. And for many of us, it's because we've never surrendered to start with. See, we tend to think, well, following Jesus is, I'm going to pray a prayer because I don't want to go to hell because that just sounds uncomfortable. And then I'll kind of halfway follow Jesus, kind of, sort of. Y'all, that's not following Jesus. That's not salvation. To be saved means you have been completely changed. You have been completely transformed from the inside out. Why? Because when you come to know Jesus, he changes your heart's desires. He changes your heart's affection. You don't have this casual view of Jesus, this casual relationship with Jesus where it's like, well, he's kind of okay. No, you fall completely in love with Jesus, and your life is completely devoted to Jesus. And that doesn't mean you get everything perfect. We all fall at different times. But if you've given your life to Christ, it'll be obvious. And here's why. Write this down. Seeing God's glory through Jesus causes me to reflect Jesus. Seeing God's glory through Jesus. When I've stepped into a relationship with Jesus, my life is going to reflect it. Because we always reflect what's inside of us. For example, take a DVD player. A DVD player is going to reflect, so to speak, what you put in it. So, if you put an M. Night Shyamalan movie in it, with the exception of Signs, it reflects something terrible. Now, if you like M. Night Shyamalan movies, that's okay. It's a free country. You're free to enjoy B-rated movies. That's okay. But I think they're all terrible. Most people are like, The Sixth Sense was awesome. No, it was not. It was a letdown. I see dead people. That's just weird. Not impressive. Historically not impressive. Lady in the Water, not okay. You know why? Because M. Night Shyamalan himself was like the hero of that movie. That's just tacky. Very tacky. You put that in, not a great movie. But if you put The Empire Strikes Back or Lord of the Rings in that DVD player, guess what? It now reflects something amazing. Because we always reflect what's inside of us. So here's the question for you and me to wrestle with. What does your life reflect? Well, what does your life reflect to the people around you? And here, let's press in on that a little further. Does your life look any different than the life of the average person who doesn't follow Jesus, with the exception of the fact that you go to church? Does it look any different? Because if we all have the same values, if we all do the same things, if we treat money the same way, if we treat our spouse the same way, if we raise our kids the same way, if we have the same habits as people distant from God, and there's not something distinctly different about our character and our lives, then guess what? It's probably because you've never given your life to Christ. Because we always reflect what's inside of us. Verse 17 says this. Now the Lord is the Spirit. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Here's what that means. Freedom to live a life that is fully devoted to God. It doesn't mean freedom to do whatever you want. And that's not true freedom anyway. Because being able to do whatever I want, that's just chaos. Take the game of baseball, which is the most beautiful game ever invented. If you remove the foul lines from a baseball field, you no longer have baseball, you have chaos. If you move the out-of-bounds lines from a football field or from a soccer field, you've got a pasture. If you take the three-point line and the out-of-bounds lines away from a basketball court, you have something that's not even recognizable anymore. Freedom doesn't mean I can do whatever I want. Freedom means, no, now through Christ, I'm empowered to do what God calls me to do. I'm empowered through His Spirit to obey Him and live a life fully devoted to Him. And here's how this happens. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory. Through Jesus, this barrier between us and God is removed. Through Jesus, we can actually see God as who He is. And this happens. We are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. In other words, when you come to know Jesus, when you completely give your life to Christ, nothing held back, that's when He begins to change you. That's when things begin to become different. That's when you finally get to this place to where you say, man, I'm fully devoted to God, nothing held back. And so in many ways, where we talked about this idea that we tend to want God to prove Himself, and then we'll believe, Jesus actually flips that around and He says, how about you take me on my word and then I'll prove myself? How about you just trust me? How about you just surrender to me? How about you just give your life to me? And then I'll prove myself. I'll change you. Because you may be here this morning and you realize you're separated from God. And you're like, well, how can I ever change? You ain't going to be the one doing the changing. God's going to be the one doing the changing. He just wants you to step into a relationship with Him. He just wants you to come to Him. You might say, well, man, how would I ever get free from this one thing that wrecks my life? Man, you're not going to be the one to get free from it. God's going to be the one who breaks you free from it. When we step into a relationship with Christ, when we dive into the pool and hold nothing back. And when that happens, Jesus changes the way we think. He changes the way we act. He changes the way we behave. And He does that starting from the inside. He changes the very attitude and desires of our heart. Because maybe you're here and you're like, well, man, I don't really feel like I want to live completely for God. Guess what? You need to surrender to Christ. And guess what? He'll put that desire in you. He'll change your desires, because when you come to know Christ, you don't just become a slightly morally better version of yourself. You become a brand new you with brand new heart and a brand new desires and brand new affections, because when you come to know Christ, you will not stay the same. So two questions to wrestle through this morning. First off, have you ever actually surrendered your life to Christ? Or have you just been kind of testing the waters? Guess what? It's time to dive in. Time to dive in. And for others this morning, the second question is this. If you have dove in, whatever the word is, if you have done that, if you have given your life to Christ, are there still moments where you're looking back where you were and still kind of thinking, man, I kind of want to go back there? or are you completely facing forward and saying, Jesus, I'm going wherever you tell me to go, doing whatever you tell me to do regardless of the consequences?